With the complexity of food supply chains, the potential for risk is inevitable, but that doesn't mean that the risk can't be managed and mitigated. I'm Lisa Lupo, your host of TAG Talks Food Safety, and today I'm welcoming TAG's Senior Director of Food Safety, Mary Hoffman, to talk about those risks and both the regulatory required and the best practices for management and mitigation. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
So let's just kind of start right at the beginning. What are the common risks in the food chain related to both specific suppliers and specific products?
Sounds great. So really, when building a supply chain program or any food safety program for that matter, it's very important to begin with an understanding of what risks are there that need to be controlled. So supply chain programs really should begin with that assessment of the inherent risks of each of your ingredients and materials that you're sourcing. So the risks will vary greatly depending upon what you're sourcing. For example, if you're sourcing some produce or something that's grown in the ground, the risks of that will be very different from something maybe that you're sourcing that your supplier has processed it. There's a validated kill step in their process. So really thinking through the biological, chemical, physical hazards in your hazard analysis is the place you need to start. And we really encourage our clients to take the time to do this step very well. Do your research to understand what those risks are. And some good sources of information for this research are, things like regulatory guidance documents. For FDA regulated products, we often encourage folks to use that FDA Appendix 1, where they'll list out what they think those potential hazards are. You can also just keep an eye on what's happening in the industry. Things like food safety recalls or food safety related incidents. So you can think about, what does that mean for the ingredients that we're sourcing? Once you've done that, you need to really focus in on the hazards that are most likely to occur or would have those very severe impacts if they did occur, and understand who is controlling that specific hazard. And if it's not you, if you're not controlling that in your facility, then you have to make sure that your supplier is controlling that for you. And then in addition, the other piece of this is, like we said, you think about the inherent risks with your ingredients or materials, but also think about what risks are associated with your suppliers. You're going to think about your history with the supplier. Do you have a long history with them? You have good confidence in their programs or controls? Or maybe it's a relatively new supplier that you're onboarding, or even a supplier that's had some recent history of food safety issues, such as regulatory interactions, warning letters, maybe product recalls. If that's the case, it's important to really understand these things so you can scale your programs accordingly. And we always say, a product recall shouldn't necessarily automatically disqualify a potential supplier. You'd have a relatively short list of suppliers to choose from, but you really need to understand what happened and what the company has done to make sure that that won't happen again.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we do want to talk about industry best practices in mitigating those risks, but let's start with the regulations. So FSMA does require that manufacturing and processing facilities have a risk-based supply chain program. Just what does that involve?
Right. So the preventive control for humans food rule requires that food facilities have that written supply chain program if their hazard analysis identifies a significant hazard, like we talked about. If that is the case, then that regulation requires, first of all, that you use approved suppliers. So you've completed your review and approval process before you use a supplier. Then you also need to determine and conduct supplier verification activities. So the regulation gives you sort of a list of verification activities that you can use. It doesn't say you have to use all of them, but you choose what's most appropriate based on the risk that's being controlled. So some examples include sampling and testing of incoming materials and ingredients. Maybe it's a review of your supplier's food safety program records. And then on-site audits are also considered a verification activity. And this one is, so the on-site audits are required according to the regulation for severe hazards, what they call the serious adverse health consequences or death
Okay.
hazards. If your supplier is controlling one of those types of hazards for you, then an on-site audit is required. That must be done by a qualified auditor. And so this means that you don't necessarily have to do that audit yourself. You can rely on a third party to conduct that on-site audit. A note on this, if a lot of companies will rely on GFSI program type audits for
Mhm.
their suppliers, which is okay, but you need to make sure you're reviewing the full audit report and you're learning about the specific controls that matter to you, what that supplier is controlling for you. So it's not quite enough to just ask for their GFSI certificate. You need to go a step further and review the audit report. Did they have any non-conformances that are important to you and the risks that are being controlled? And if so, how did they take care of those? Do you have confidence in those programs? Another part of it, the requirements from the regulations are receiving procedures. So when these items arrive at your facility, how do people know, is this coming from an approved supplier? How do they know, what the verification activities are? Do we need to pull samples? Do we need to review a certificate of analysis? Whatever that is needs to be included in receiving procedures. And then supplier corrective actions. So the agency will look for records of what happened when there were some deficiencies identified. If your ingredients, if you did some testing and you got an undesirable result, what was the follow-up to that? How did you make sure that they investigated the issue and took appropriate corrective action? Now, of course, with all regulations, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So they will be looking for records to show that you did all of those things that you said you would do.
Okay. But, really, Mary, when you follow regulations or even sometimes GFSI, you're really just doing the basics of food safety. And once a supply chain program is set, things can change, as we've really seen very clearly lately with the global trade environment. So, what else would you advise food manufacturers to do, not only to ensure that they have considered all the risks, but that they continue to stay on top of things to manage any new potential risks?
Right. It is so important to stay on top of what's happening in the industry. So you want to be aware of food safety incidents that happen, like outbreaks or recalls, and think about whether there's a similar risk related to your products, to your ingredients, to your suppliers. Right? We said, you did this really great ingredient hazard analysis with the information that was available at the time. But things change. The science can change and it does change. So our understanding of, what those reasonably foreseeable hazards has to change and keep up with the things that we know now, the things that are happening in the industry. So you want to build into your system ongoing monitoring of industry happenings along with ongoing monitoring and assessment of your supplier's performance. So also consider trends and findings from your internal programs that might be impacted by what's happening with your suppliers. So for example, are you starting to see more foreign materials that could be coming in with some of your ingredients? Are you seeing some things in your finished product testing that might hint to some issues that are going on with your suppliers as well? So it's really just key to, you can't write this program, be done with it, stick it on the shelf, and assume it's going to be good. You just really need to do that continual review of the program and of conditions to make sure you're adequately controlling that risk.
Okay. So, a manufacturer's food supply chain can really have numerous branches that fork out in all directions, but it's still all interrelated. So, having a good relationship and open communication throughout the chain really is crucial. Can you discuss the partnering that's needed between a manufacturer and their suppliers to, ensure the food is safe?
Absolutely. And you said it, Lisa, right? We really want to consider our suppliers as our partners. We want to work together to ensure the safety of the food, safety of consumers, work to create those effective communication channels so that if something happens at your supplier, if something goes wrong, you want them to be comfortable to reach out to you, let you know what happened, what they're doing about it, so you can really address any potential risks to your products. Um, Also for suppliers that maybe aren't quite where you'd like them to be in terms of the maturity of their food safety programs, you can work together with them on improving those programs. Maybe you've got some more resources or expertise in some certain food safety topics that you can work with them to raise the dial on those food safety programs. Also, in the meantime, you can implement some extra verification or monitoring activities to protect your products and your customers.
So I really want to thank you, Mary, for your insights on supply chain risks and how to manage and mitigate them. But in thinking, of all that you've discussed today, are there any key points that you'd really like for our audience to be sure to remember and take away?
Yes, absolutely. So the first main takeaway is build your food safety programs based on risk. It all comes back to that detailed hazard analysis so you can put your resources where they're needed the most. And then the second main takeaway is to stay up to date on all those changes in the industry. One way to do that is to sign up for TAG's newsletters, which are a great source of information for what's happening in the food industry, or even follow us on LinkedIn, where you can access all of that free content that we're putting out all the time. And never hesitate to reach out to us if you need any help.
All right. Well, thank you again, Mary. And I also want to thank our listeners for listening in as we talk about all the risks that can occur in your supply chain, but how to really manage and mitigate them. And for all our listeners to stay informed on all things food safety and to ensure you don't miss any episodes of Tag Talks, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or whatever is your favorite podcast platform. Thank you again.
Thank you.